So, in the year 1715, as the North rose up in rebellion at disgust at the German king who'd been foisted upon them without their consent, and as the Whigs in London prosecuted their very un-Whig-like scheme to repeal the Triennial Act and have general elections every 7 years so they could bribe everyone and choke the life out of the Tories, as Handel began sketches for a sweeping, majestic number called Sarabande, and as the fashion for wearing wigs a little lower on the brow than last season took hold, a tall, stooped, slightly furtive figure walked from his family's beautiful brick townhouse in Bohemia Place in the village of Hackney, that Arcadia beyond Moorfields, to buy a pair of squirrel bone ice skates.
Prithee, I must buy a pair of squirrel-bone skates. A pair of squirrel-bone skates I must have.
He entered into his diary to the light of a flickering wax candle and the kick of a gin punch in his student digs in the Temple the night before. But Fleet Street had disappointed him, as had the shops and stalls of Cheapside and Cornhill, the sheds of St. Paul's Yard with their fantastic painted serpents and mermaids swaying in the wind, and elsewhere. So to Moorfields he went, that quagmire of departing coaches and chic mollies and link boys, smiling softly for a love that they could not obey, and beyond, to find a pair of squirrel-bone ice skates through the bowling green and vinegar yards of Hoxton, the private lunatic asylums of Haggerston, across the Emperor's Old Road at Kingsland, past the turnpike, and on to the hoof-harrowed road to Hackney. You can see something of it there. The city behind him reduced itself to a tiny fleck on the horizon of brick and mortar, the dome of the freshly built St. Paul's bulging in the sky. And the mud track led to a cluster of villages. There was Homberton, which was the richest village. It had a street called Money Lane. Shacklewell, where, as is well known, prisoners were once chained up and chucked down the well. Newington Green, with its effete French people and dissenters and literati. And the jewel in the crown, near where we're standing now, was, of course, Hackney Village, with its brick and terraces, its sweetly flowing brook, coffee houses, boarding schools, and Mermaid Tavern with delicious cream and shuffleboard. It was every shopkeeper's dream to retire to that Arcadia beyond Moorfields, to Hackney. And Dudley Ryder's linen draper father of Ironmonger Row in the city had certainly thought so. The fields were punctuated by the odd tavern, way stations of delicious light pink wine called Claret from Gascony, and one such now came into view for the diarist, the Dog and Shoulder of Mutton. Anyone been? Some of you have. Outside which the locals were greasing the tails of pigs, swinging them round their heads, and seeing who could throw them the furthest, culminating in a cacophony of oinks and squeals as the pigs crashed snout down. It's all true. But the tall trees of London fields, an ancient mustering ground for steeds that gave Hackney its name. Hackney! A man rushed up to our traveller and exhorted him to take the threat posed to Europe by the Turks somewhat more seriously. By the way, these are all real quotes from the diary. Nothing has been made up.
Walking through London fields, the houses of Hackney and Clapton forming a silhouette on the horizon, a man with an unruly wig came charging towards me, grabbed me by the throat, and urged me to take the threat posed to Europe by the Turks more seriously. Removing his hand, I bid my leave of him, and do sincerely hope I never encounter such a disgrace of a human being again, notwithstanding the great merit of his argument.
On to Sylvester Path, and who should he walk past outside the Cock Tavern, strutting like a peacock in his raft and white gloves, the golden buttons of his mantle glimmering in the sun? It was his brother, William. He was so flash, and that was not the Presbyterian way. It perturbed his mind to wonder, however he afforded such a glittering deportment. Had he been robbing his father's till, or worse, the roads and paths of Hackney were stalked by highwaymen? But never mind this matter now. Dudley Ryder was a man on a mission. He must find a pair of squirrel bone ice skates before it was too late. And there, amid the shops and stalls of Mare Street, on a lopsided shelf guarded by a man with one eye, next to a bottle of Civic Cologne perfume, it lay, the final pair. Into his satchel they went, as he hot-footed it to the junction of Mare Street and the road to Hackney to await the coach. This took him all the way into the city, his blood glowing and agitated with felicity. And finally, in the relative tranquility of the temple, he walked past Fountain Court and went down the stairs to the Thames. And it was there that this gauche, gangly, 23-year-old law student, diarist from Hackney, beheld the frozen Thames.
I went to see the Thames, which is froze over. I was extremely struck with the sight. It is all froze over. It looks as if there had been a violent storm and it had froze the waves, just as they were jostling and beating against one another. And the billows and foam and white froth were grown stiff, just as they were at the height of their hurry.
Dudley Ryder was astonished to see something of such perpetual motion, something that took so many different guises and forms, something flowing so fast, but sometimes so slow, sometimes choppy, sometimes not a ripple on the surface, something so fluid and ever-changing, frozen into a single unambiguous form, ossified in a single moment of time, its machinations laid bare for everyone to see. Beyond the obvious sublimity of the prospect, it made him feel a little uneasy. For Dudley Ryder was the shapeshifter supreme, master of disguises, the chameleon of Hackney, and ever in motion, he didn't like the idea of being stilled and probed. Still, he put on his squirrel bone skates, boarded the frost fair, and glided over, past oxen being roasted, past games of skittles, past bear baiting on the ice, and to a poetry tent, where he handed in a line he had with great satisfaction composed, and looked forward to seeing the rental poet complete. He would pass it off as his own in the Grecian coffee house later that day. So I first heard of, has anyone read the diary of, no, you don't need to now. I first heard about it when I was a postgraduate studying for a PhD in the impact of the media. And I got wind of the fact that there was this incredible diary that hadn't really been tapped that well. And I came to believe that it was actually a lot better than Samuel Pepys's in many ways. I was looking to understand what it was like to pass from an age of strict censorship to one where there was essentially a free press, where there was a glut of news, as one newspaper, The Grumbler, put it, just to try and extract universal truths of what that does to a coffee-addled brain, to live in a world without it, and then suddenly you're just showered in these rivulets of intelligence, all these newspapers, 20 a week, 100,000 circulating every week, and to see how that kind of shaped people's ideas and worldviews and even their personality. And Ryder was absolutely perfect for that, because he was insanely impressionable.
7th of June, 1716. I am too apt to be led by the opinions of others and don't know how to stand on my own legs and judge for myself.
Furthermore, he was one of the biggest coffee junkies that the nation had ever seen. Why does that matter? Because it was in the coffee houses where the news circulated. Every time you walked in, you would just see this kind of aroma of steam, or smell the aroma of steam. And there would be long wooden tables strewn with every type of media imaginable. And then people would start screaming in your face, "Your servant, sir, what news from Tripoli?" And before you were allowed to sit down, you had to divulge a nugget, something that you'd read, something that you'd heard, or something you just made up on the spot. I don't think my clicker's actually making contact with that. Could you tilt it? That's it.
Well,
yeah,
that's me.
just go a few. Yeah, perfect. Good. One more. One more. There we go. So that's the kind of place. And Hackney was absolutely full, just like it is today, really. It was absolutely full of coffee houses, the most famous being the Hackney Coffee House, which is where the Cock Tavern is near today. And we have some vivid eyewitness accounts of what it was actually like to go into these places. It was a beautiful sort of sensory bombardment. You'd hear the kind of bubbling of the coffee cauldron, the flickering of the candles, the squawking of the long-suffering coffeehouse cat. They thought that the coffee, or the bitter Mohammedan gruel, as it was known, would taste better if you let the cat go to the toilet inside it. So there was always a coffeehouse cat. And anyone who could smoke would smoke. They called their ladles of tobacco the nasty puffing engines. So that was all going on as well. But you didn't go there with friends or family members. You went there to meet strangers and to commune and to sit down and to enter the kind of communion of news. As we hear from the 21st of February, 1716. You're probably going to get bored of the bell at some point, but we'll keep going for a bit.
I went to the Grecian coffee house. There was a great deal of the best company there. Stayed by some of them, heard their talk. The 6 condemned lords are to be executed Friday. Friday, 26th February. Went to Brothers in the city, then quick passage to the Grecian coffee house. There I heard many gentlemen of good sense discussing the execution. I ventured to sit down among some of them and talk a little about the execution of the lords today. Heard them talk a great deal. This led us on to a debate about the ease of death by beheading. Are organisms still alive after the head if severed? Mr. Whitnam thinks not, but Mr. Porter points to a cruel experiment he tried in his garden in Islington, whereby he cut a snake in half and watched it slither in different directions. This was what we were disputing for a good while, but came to no determination.
It's a good debate to have. Has anyone had that debate? I recommend it. Could we go back one so we can see the beautiful dandyish fop that he was?
Is that me?
No, sadly not. Well, it is for the purposes of tonight, yeah. As in this evening, not tonight. So I began to fall under the spell of this little-known diary. Why wasn't it more widely known? With fantastic gobbets like that. I mean, how could it not be more widely known? Ryder didn't live through anything, how did I put this? Things like the Great Fire or the Great Plague, but what it lacked in catastrophic bravura, it more than made up for in the richness of the portrait it painted of the inner world of its keeper, as you can see. And it's of a much greater psychological depth, I think, than the raw and salty Samuel Pepys. For me, it opened a window onto the reality of what it was like to be alive in London when it was the biggest city in Europe, the fulcrum of this empire overseas, and in its minutiae, it could tell you things that you'd never find in conventional history books, mollified by the mediations of historians stuck in libraries. So I had a vision. I wanted to grasp Ryder, not literally. Wanted to understand why he seemed to spend all his days drifting between these coffee houses, not just in the city, but in Hackney as well, and to try and make his world palpable. And in time, I would plot these enormous maps showing exactly where he went when, in an effort to kind of get to know him better. But there was one problem. It transpired when I was about maybe like 4 or 5 months in, that I was working from a heavily redacted version of the diary. It was a version of the diary that had been published in 1939, when sensibilities were somewhat prudish, and it only contained half of everything that he wrote in this secret shorthand, for very good reason, it turned out. So there was only one thing for it. I decided I had to travel north to the seat of the Ryder family, they still exist, in Northamptonshire, and get my hands on the original. I can remember the day well. The taxi driver told me that he thought English food was bland and tasteless. There was a flicker of trepidation in the eyes of Lady Harrowby, the lady who was the direct ancestor, when I said I was planning to read the whole thing. Just a flicker of trepidation. She wasn't too happy about it. There was a demon archivist who refused to let me eat any food while I photocopied all 3,000 pages of the transcript, and then ruthlessly pursued me for an outstanding £1.20 debt for many months afterwards, because some of the pages were, I messed up, and like not all the words were on, so I had to re-photocopy them. I was shown the resplendent portrait of Dudley Ryder hanging in the mansion above the staircase, and what a contrast it was to the shy and insecure youth trapped within the pages of the diary, freshly glazed by the extortionate photocopier. But the mission was successful, and I alighted at Euston, as people do, with a satchel bulging full of the innermost thoughts and secret desires of the greatest diary that no one had ever heard of. Meeting two friends from much needed, might I say, truly well-earned bottle of wine at the Euston Tap, the corpus of his diary, huge piles of leaves, lay stacked up before us on an empty chair. It was as though he were there with us. It was like he was the fourth, or perhaps we were one of him. So as some of you might know, there's only so long you can spend in Oxford without losing your mind. Maybe it's too late, I don't know. 5 years was really pushing it. So I did the undergraduate and then master, and then I stupidly decided to stay for a bit too long. But I didn't want to end up just sequestered. I wanted to escape the bowers of academe because there was a world beyond the beige fortress. I kind of needed to be in London anyway to find all these newspapers, to find all the diaries, and I felt drawn to Hackney. I knew it a bit at the time. We're going back to 2006, I think, long time. But I knew it a bit because I had an art journalist friend called Melissa. She's got a beautiful black cat called Vespucci. Some of you might have seen him. And she found Oxford equally suffocating. It was cheap enough to rent around here, not that far out. It's not like what it is now. It was different. There were bright yellow murder notices sprouting from the concrete almost on a weekly basis. But nonetheless, in spite of that, the area felt alive, and there was a lingering sense of change in the air. What was the first thing that you all saw in Hackney? Just 3 people tell me, or I'll pick on you. Sorry? It is, yeah. Well, okay, those of you who weren't born in Hackney, didn't grow up in Hackney, when you came to Hackney, what was the first thing you ever saw? Okay, perfect. That's great. What was your one? The 73 bus to Church Street, is it? Yeah, perfect. The Hackney Empire? Okay. These are beautiful. Anyone else want to chip in? These are beautiful. I'll tell you the first thing I ever saw. It was a wall on Broadway Market saying, "Middle-class wankers, fuck off." Yeah, they lost. But yeah, little did they realize, whoever might have been an art thing, I don't know. But they had been here for hundreds of years earlier, or for hundreds of years. Don't need the earlier. Dudley Ryder lived in a 4-story brick townhouse in Bohemia Place. His father had risen to prominence through trade, though his status as a dissenter, a Puritan basically, barred him from any kind of civic office. But he was highly respectable, and the household emblematized the surging wealth of the middling sort. What did he have? He had servants, wallpaper, and beautiful umbrellas. There were tallow candles and silver candle snuffs. There was a stables allowing Dudley and his family to ride to Kentish Town to visit his Tory cousins, the Marshalls, whom he absolutely hated. There was a lovely collection of romances and novels, beautifully bound editions of The Spectator, not the current Spectator, which pretends to be the original, but it's not. This is the one that was written by Addison and Steele way back at the beginning of the 18th century and pioneered a new form of journalism. It had a kind of horrid clearness about it, but they were socially instructive as well.
14th of September, 1715. Snug in my bedchamber, red wine by my side, I ransacked my catalogue of spectators in order to observe the peculiar thoughts upon gallant subjects, such as are proper to entertain the ladies with, that I may have wherewith to keep up the conversation with them. So formerly a kind of aristocratic playground, this whole area was. That's why it's Bohemia Place, because the Queen of Bohemia stayed here. There were hunting lodges, places like Sutton House. But these aristocrats had been displaced by the early 18th, and actually a long time before, by the mid-17th century, I would say, by families like the Ryders. And the Ryders were by no means the richest. You know, in the taverns with their gilt-edged tables and their troughs brimming with claret,
and the smoky candlelit coffee houses, Ryder mingled with bankers, famous writers, famous ventriloquists, politicians, and even directors of one of the biggest companies in the world.
24th of February, 1716. To the Hackney Coffee House after dinner. I felt a little timorous and afraid by the presence there of a director of the East India Company. Sensing my unease, he called me by name and asked if there was any news. This assuaged my nerves no end, and together we smoked a pipe of the divine Nicotian weed.
That's tobacco. So the Georgian houses in which they lived are still all around us. And somewhere like Broadway Market, where the pigs were once hurled, it's a manifestation of exactly the kind of conspicuous consumption that characterized the lives of Hackney's first colonizers. Personally, I hate Broadway Market with its organic cherries and extortionate artisan delights and baby massages for £80 at last check. I hated it then, I hate it now. So I chose to live a little further west in Dalston, which was much more fun, in a former fishhook factory. Each day I would comb through the diary, and each day I would walk past the places, and sometimes the very buildings mentioned by this guy. I cycled to Hackney Marshes, where Ryder perceived giants and demons in the twilight, drank wine in London Fields, where the dog and shoulder of mutton had mysteriously morphed into the cat and mutton. So some of you probably have drunk there. I passed through the oddly engulfed village of Shacklewell. I went to the bars of Hoxton, where the forming Bowling Green had become Bowling Green Estate. Now as then, Hackney, as I said, was full of coffee houses. I, like he, overindulged in coffee to the extent that I got extreme heart palpitations for weeks on end, culminating in quite a harrowing visit to Homerton Hospital, where Money Lane seemed to have become Morning Lane, mysteriously. Disappointingly, the Mermaid Tavern, which was beloved actually by Samuel Pepys, who used to go on these little Hackney holidays to get out of the city, that had become Mermaid Fabrics, which I think is, or is it Mermaid Electronics? It's Mermaid something, it's still there, I think. And one morning, the greatest epiphany of all, I realized that the bus I took to get into the city, the 242, not the 73, but the 242 on this occasion, followed exactly the same route that Ryder walked practically every day from his family home in Hackney to his lodgings in the Middle Temple. Through Hoxton, de Beauvoir Town didn't exist yet, into the city at Moorfields, turning right at the Royal Exchange, which he loved because it was a great emporium of news, down the ancient high street of Cheapside, and past the very same cathedral that he would have seen. And I was living just a 10-minute walk from where he had lived in Bohemia Place, now where many of the buses that trace his route set off on their rumble. I was also exactly the same age as him at the time, a sense of worlds colliding or melting into one another. So sometimes when you look at a house, all is not what it seems. Just imagine you're looking at an elegant Georgian house with its kind of brick-built facade, conforming to kind of order and harmony, these kind of classical aesthetic principles. But sometimes you peer behind it and you discover that actually you've been duped, and behind it is a kind of timber-framed, tumble-down house, which might have been left over from the Tudor or medieval era. The frontage is just that, a facade, fooling all those who walk by. And what's true of buildings can be true of psychology as well. As a 23-year-old living in London for the first time, finally free of the strictures of Oxford, there was a sense of liberation and wonder and possibility and even mischievousness having landed in Hackney, which I think a lot of people feel. A period of quite wild experimentation as I tried to figure out who I was and what I was for. Still a work in progress, I guess. London can be quite gloriously anonymous, and it was that quality that made this work, and it was that quality that allowed it for Ryder to become a great catwalk of deceit. Because in the Middle Ages, everyone kind of knew everyone else in the parish. But by the 18th century, that wasn't the case. With 500,000 inhabitants, London was one giant built-up conurbation from Hanover Square in the west all the way through to Limehouse in the east. And you could walk for 10 minutes and you'd become anonymous. You'd become obliterated like a grain of sand on the shore. Has anyone read the diary of John Byrom? He was a Mancunian poet who left Manchester to launch a radical new system of shorthand in London. And it was only meant to take a week. And then he didn't bother going back to Manchester for 35 years, never bothered going back, even though his wife and kids were up there. He loved it so much. But he said, when he arrived, he said, "I'm lost in this place of grand resort. Through crowds, more crowds I see. Quite from the city to the court, 'tis all a wilderness to me." An American visitor landing in London, he said it reminded him of a great vast forest surrounded by noise, dirt, and the vast expanse of the city. So to insulate themselves against the kind of ennui and dislocation, loneliness of this bewildering city, Londoners like him would seek out social spaces whose atmospheres they perhaps found congenial and stimulating, where they could try out guises, wear masks, and performatively at least become the person that they wanted to be, at least that day. That's what myself and a lot of my compatriots were doing in the bars of Dalston and the coffee houses of Bloomsbury, Soho, Southwark, etc., thinking more open-mindedly, dressing differently. My jeans were just as skinny as Ryder's breeches in those days. But he took this social masquerade to quite extraordinary, and some might say sociopathic, proportions. And it was predominantly in the coffee houses, which were theatres of judgment, that the alchemy occurred. He was pathologically obsessed with how he was perceived.
I went to John's coffee house by the Royal Exchange. Our conversation turned to the folly of marriage. Jackson always makes us laugh. He has an excellent talent that way in putting whatever he describes or talks of in a most ridiculous light. I don't know how he seems to see everything in a more comical, ridiculous light than other people. I was most displeased, however, with Mr. Whitnome and his tendency to jig me under the table with his foot every time he feels someone has constructed a sentence in an infelicitous manner. I am terrified the others will take notice of this and think me a companion in arms of this treachery. I kicked him hard, and he stopped. 29th of July, 1715. Went in the coach with Mr. Burgess, where there were two strangers. I thought I made some kind of figure in the eyes of the strangers by talking as I did with him about Leyden and the affairs of the college there. Indeed, I observe I then speak best when I am in strange company that don't know me at all. 28th of August, 1716. I was stung by a wasp in our garden in Hackney. There was a great deal of pain that my hand swelled. However, I bore it with a great deal of patience on purpose to have it taken notice of.
So yeah, from the ridiculous to the sublime. He cared about his appearance, particularly so when he walked past the New Exchange, which is kind of still there on Cheapside.
21st of June, 1715. There is indeed a noble collection of looking-glass, the finest, I believe, in Europe. I could not, as I passed by there, help observing myself, particularly my manner of walking, and that pleased me very well, for I thought I did it with a very genteel and becoming air.
So do you like this person, or do you think he's a bit of a pompous? He takes a while to warm, or you take a while to warm to him, but he's curiously addictive. Anyway, it went deeper than this, than vanity, admiring your reflection. He was obsessed with his manner of thinking, with his turns of phrase, the virtues of his argument, his posture, his social carriage, his ease and familiarity in the company of women. Sometimes he had turned to printed journals in this relentless quest for self-improvement, underlying the transformative impact of the press, even in its fledgling form, showing that print really could mold minds.
I read The Spectator and The Tatler yet again to understand the correct manner of connecting thoughts and ideas so that I might cut a finer figure in polite company.
And as we've heard, he collected these and read them furiously every night in his bedchambers, often weeping into the candle because he hadn't lived up to his expectations. But it wasn't really literature or newspapers where he got these ideas from. Mainly it was just by observing people. It was the people that he watched. Sometimes they were people he knew, but most of the time they were perfect strangers. His eyes darted back and forth like little baby tadpoles as he roamed his gaze over the entire gamut of humanity on display in the taverns and the coffee houses, in search of something to borrow or to steal, or at least to try on. It might be an arched eyebrow, a silky turn of phrase, or a manner of flirtation.
3rd of October, 1716. The more I hear Mr. Illes talk, the more I admire him for his great memory and pretty manner of telling his stories. I could not help reflecting upon myself what a vast difference there was between him and me, that he had something to say continually, and I was at a loss to find matter of conversation.
But he didn't stop at that. He was quite content to steal entire experiences, to pass off people's stories as his own, to lie about his background, to emulate other people's tastes in music, gardening, and art, to actually thieve people's identity. He overhears one guy in a coffee talk about his travels in France, and then he just nicks it and then relays it the next night in an effort to gain social kudos. He would play the part. In Buttons and Covent Garden, he might play the man of letters. In Jonathan's, in the City, the master investor. In the Grecian, the sage of legal London. In the Hoxton Square coffee house, the medical man. That's a bit confused. The Hoxton Square coffee house was renowned for what they called inquisitions of insanity, where suspected mad people were tied up and thrown in, and everyone would go and prod them and judge whether they were actually mad or not. And then you'd be dragged away if you were. So that's why he says that. In Slaughters, he was the connoisseur. In Hackney, sometimes the rakish romantic. In St. James's, he was the coffee house politician. And in Will's, the rake. And the diary was totally crucial in this quest. It was a monument to his great enterprise of deceit. It was there between its pages, its crisp cream pages, that he logged the details of those whom he admired, and of course, as a counterpoint, those whom he found utterly objectionable.
My cousin, Benjamin Ryder, is a lad of a very shallow head and little sense that makes me wonder what should be the reason that several of my uncle's friends are so mighty civil to him as to invite him to come and see them, and receive him into their company, especially when he goes so meanly dressed as to be a disgrace to them that keep him company.
It was in his diary, too, that he cast brutal judgments upon himself. So his forebears, his ancestors, who were all Puritans, they kept diaries too, but it was always just to sort of assess how spiritually pure they had been in the course of the day, you know, how unprone to temptation they had been. He kind of does the same thing, but shifts it into a secular sphere. So he is judging his performance, but it's his social performance as well. And he's pretty harsh on himself.
19th of October, 1715. I am mighty apt to be uneasy in the company of strange ladies, and don't know how to compose my mouth, my eyes, or settle my hands or legs. It is a great unhappiness for me. It must certainly appear very ill to others, but I am at a loss how to mend it. 15th of June, 1715. My brother William has got to be a prodigious degree of assurance, or rather impudence, with respect to young ladies. He seems to have no manner of regard to anything of decency on this side of the downright bawdy, with this one talent only, without anything of genteel address, polite conversation, or even oftentimes nonsense, and a very ill style and manner of speaking. I am vexed with myself that I cannot help envying him, and that I cannot rest satisfied with my own superior merit.
And as the mask became the face, as he concealed all his shortcomings, his envy, his shyness, his fears, his cravings, his inarticulacy from the world, the diary became the only place where his true self remained, an anchor of reality in a world of smoke and powder. And that's why he wanted it to remain secret. That's why it was written in a really enigmatic and impenetrable, I think, form of shorthand. It was actually cracked by the same guy that cracked the Enigma code. That's how heavily he really didn't want anyone to read it. And that too is why so much of it offended the more prudish sensibilities of 1939, why indeed there was a flicker of fear in Lady Harrowby's eye. There were things in there she really did not want me to find, such as this.
31st of August, 1715. Went to the club. Our discourse turned upon the bawdy. Mr. Crisp asserted a man might do it 8 times to a woman in a night, which Mr. Heathcote thought impossible, and Mr. Porter, also from the formation, the parts. However, Mr. Jackson asserted that he had done it himself 5 times, and Mr. Demoise had told him he had done it 8 times in 3 or 4 hours. Today, the articles of impeachment against the Earl of Stafford were passed, and ordered engrossed for high crimes and misdemeanours. 19th November, 1715. Our talk in the tavern about the merits of polygamy so raised my blood that I felt a mighty inclination to fill a whore's commodity. I found a pretty little whore in an alley off Fleet Street. I was a little confounded what to say to her, and could not rally her as I would have done. So I decided to practice quintillion upon her, and after some simple rhetoric, I parted with her and came home and frigged myself. I am vexed with myself that I have not the command of myself so much as to stop such an inclination without satisfying it, though I have often resolved against it.
So what a weird guy. He finds a prostitute, he has a discussion about polygamy, gets his blood up. He actually was very anti-marriage, and he argued for polygamy years later. But he's so aroused by this, he resolves to find a prostitute. He does find one in an alley off Fleet Street, but then he gets nervous and practices rhetoric on her instead. Sharpens up his prowess from quintillion, then goes home and frigs himself. So it was a balanced day, I think, that one. Something else that's possibly quite unflattering is his attitudes towards those beneath him on the social pyramid. You can kind of attribute this, I'm afraid, to his upbringing in Hackney. As I've tried to evoke, Hackney was very much like the Henley-on-Thames or the Gerrard's Cross of its day back then. He probably very rarely encountered the hoi polloi. And his snobbery in this regard best shines through when he's talking about the dangers and evils of media manipulation. Ryder was a die-hard Whig, the forerunners of the Liberals. They believed in religious tolerance, they didn't want wars, and they thought power was vested in Parliament rather than a divinely appointed king, whereas the Tories thought everything that was to the contrary of that. He absolutely hated the Tories. He suspected they were all Jacobites who wanted to get rid of this German king and bring back a Catholic king. And of all the Tories he met, he hated none of them as much as his aunt, who he occasionally had to gallop to meet in Kentish Town, where they still live today. The Tories, not the aunt.
Talked with my Aunt Marshall in Kentish Town about politics. She is extremely violent and cannot tell how to keep her temper. She still keeps to the old way of saying the most absurd and shocking things that silence one at once, unless one may venture flatly to contradict her. They are indeed all violent Tories, and by their actions, though deny it in words, show that they are really for the pretender.
Whenever he encountered anything remotely pro-Tory or critical of the Whig regime, he agonized over the effect that it was going to have on those who were too stupid to think for themselves.
Went to the British Coffee House, stayed there an hour, looked over many of the examiners. I never met with an author so very bald with truth and so impudently asserting falsehood in my life, and yet his paper must do a great deal of harm, at least in hardening the Tories against my possibility of conviction.
So this media manipulation, it was always something that happened to other people. He never once considered that it could be he himself who was being brainwashed.
How I despise the weak, silly people, the credulous men who are willing to believe whatever is put to them with the greatest assurances and confidence, even if the most absurd lie.
So the media reinforced his own worldviews, convincing people that they were right and anyone who disagreed was wrong. So not much has really changed. We can probably agree pessimistically. It was only really when he encountered someone he respected who might tell him something a bit different, something that jarred with what he believed already, and then occasionally he would budge. But generally, he didn't. He was narrow-minded in that regard. He didn't even necessarily care all that much about the news as being seen to be au courant with it. He didn't really care what the news was. He just wanted to be seen to be in the know because he thought he could trade that for yet more social kudos. So, sitting in the audience, listening to all of that, all of these readings, you may well think he comes across as unbelievably sort of pompous and fake, almost like a kind of hyacinth bouquet of Hackney Central, just completely obsessed with appearances to a level of artifice which is hard to stomach. But I've never really seen him in that light, although superficially that is how he comes across. But in many ways, he was a paragon of the Enlightenment, this new age. Because if you take the story all the way back into the Middle Ages and actually beyond, people were just seen as vessels of sin. They were receptacles, either of God's grace or not. You either went to heaven or you went to hell. His ancestors, the Puritans, the kind of people that lived in Hackney in the 17th century, they believed in Calvinist double predestination, the idea that God had predetermined since before the beginning of time who was going to go to heaven and who was going to go to hell, and nothing you could do could change his mind. So again, not much point. But by the time you get to the Enlightenment, built upon the scientific ideas, they no longer believe in innate ideas. They believe that humankind is a tabula rasa that can be molded by one's environment, depending on what you read and who you interacted with. So you can improve yourself, you can better yourself, and collectively that would lead to the betterment of society. This was promulgated by the Spectator and the Tatler, but it was the Earl of Shaftesbury, the great philosopher, who probably put it in the most memorable way. He said, you envisage the kind of people like this, who were socially aspirant and going to the taverns and coffee houses, kind of like marbles. And the more people that you saw and emulated and interacted with, the more you would chisel away your rough, antisocial edges and become polished, politesse, which is where we get the word politeness from. Because although some of this sounds pretty raw and blunt, remember this is what he didn't want people to know. None of this would have been expressed at the time. It would have been a certain kind of horror for Ryder to actually have said anything that caused offense or insult, anything that didn't flatter the interlocutor, because everyone was meant to be improving everybody else. So for me, the diary is far more than a litany of catty comments, navel-gazing, and the need for validation gone completely berserk, though those things are very much in evidence, admittedly. But it's perhaps something a bit nobler than that. He was a flawed guy. He had lots of faults. But when you read the diary as a whole, it attests to, and in a way is a magnificent monument to mankind's infinite capacity for change. And he succeeded in the end. Could we have the final image? I'll show you what he became. That. So, from the bowling greens, dissenting academies, and landscape walks of Hackney to the ancient quadrangles of the Middle Temple, Dudley Ryder, this guy, fooled the world. He rose up to occupy the highest legal office in the land, that of Lord Chief Justice, where he personally oversaw the butchery of the 45 Jacobite rebels. This master of disguises, the chameleon from Hackney, he willed an entirely new composite identity into existence, banishing his former inadequate self to the diary and rising up to become what he'd always wanted to be, which was the king of the law. So we're going to end with a monologue. I mean, that kind of was a monologue already, but we're going to end with another monologue from Dudley Ryder himself. Could we play this? Do you have Spotify in here? Can we sync it up to...
Some were born to greatness, some were born to die. Some were born to change the world, I never even tried. Shrouded in the shadows, so many masks of mine, facing down the darkness, stealing just one more line. A tilt of the head, a twist of the toe, a sullen glance, that perfect bon mot. And in this dish I find the future, oh past that puffing engine. Striding through the fields, riding a chair down the mare, stopping off at the pyramids to gather with some friends of mine there. Whitney, Defoe, Bolingbroke and Marshall, Heathcote, Wishcote, and many more besides. For I am Dudley, riding past that battered mast, or whatever word you uttered last. Yes, I am Dudley, so fine, taking what is yours, making it mine. I'm a moon curser at night, yes. In dark tunnels of these streets, I'll burrow blind. The voyeur of your darkness and mine, I'll take you through those courts, those nasty sodden lanes, to find those who round themselves in the black mists of the night. But I get ahead of myself. You must find a pair of squirrel-bone skates. You take me for a fool? Have you had too much gruel? I watch you close, like you watch me. Closer and closer and closer we watch, never knowing what lies beneath. There was a time, I perceive, a time, I believe, when I knew what I could have been. If I'd only had more time, who one day I might be. Lost, lost, lost within, lost and lost and lost once again. I walk past the glass of new change, so fine, and ask, is this my reflection, or just a hideous projection? In footsteps we measure our loss, in sugar our fault, in the nasty black buildings that rise into the foul putrid air, smeared in sea coal and regret. Our eyes never meeting. But we won't speak of that, nor the passing of time. Our death waits in the wings, thinking the strangest things. I have waited in the darkness, I have skulked in the gloom, the least convicting actor in this sad, sorry room, biding my time like a coiled spring. And remember, I've been planning it, I've been watching you for years. Now I've vanquished my fears. Becoming you is never so easy, never so fine. I'll rise up while you sink to the reprehensible level of swine. For I am Dudley. I used to be me, but no more. Now I'm you, and with it the moon will howl, the sea all drunken and blue. I ask and ask and ask once again, are you the one I've been searching for?
Okay, thanks. Any questions? So many hands have gone up. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good. So basically, there was the original in this extremely difficult to crack shorthand code. The person that transcribed it into English prose was called William Matthews, and that eventually became this redacted version, but I found out that there was the full transcript, and it literally had entire lines crossed out and things that they didn't want to put in. But it wasn't crossed out to the extent that I couldn't read it. So I went, that's why it took so long with the photocopier, and then just typed the whole thing out. So it was originally a manuscript, yeah. But that means I'm the only person on Earth who's read the whole thing. So it's been so nice to share it with you here today. Yeah, I would love to. But the problem is that publishers say, well, where's the drama? And I say, well, okay, there's no fire. The drama's in here. Well, he made it dramatic, yeah. Maybe you could do the audiobook. And we got the soundtrack as well. Yeah, he's just a really fascinating guy, and I, as you could tell from some of that, became quite enchanted by him. And
was there anything too rude for this?
Yes, quite a lot, actually. Yeah, I'd love to say go and read it for yourself, but, I mean, you can read the redacted version. I'd like him to be a character in one of my books at some point, so it may yet surface. But it's it just gives a really vivid insight into Hackney at the time, which was really surprising when I first read it. Yeah. Well, this is another mystery. So he started writing it when he was 23 years of age, and he lays out his reasons for starting it very clearly. Everything I have said is true. Yeah, I'm a historian. It's true. Yeah, I was 23 at the time. He was 23 when he started it. He leaves a very clear rationale for why he's writing it. He says that he's worried about, he's got a weak memory, and he thinks that if you write stuff down, then that will fasten it in the mind, as he puts it. And he also wants to keep a log of what he's reading, and just to keep track of these pernicious Jacobite Tory people that are swirling about. Now, he wrote it in the year 1715 to 1716, and then one day in September 1716, it just stops mid-sentence. And it's the view of the transcriber, W. Matthews, 1939, that the rest of it was destroyed or lost. And he thinks it could actually have gone on for years, if not decades. But we don't have that. We don't know if that's true or not. But he wouldn't have just stopped it, because he didn't die. As you see, he became this pompous judge in the end. It's a bit of a mystery and a tragedy. Maybe it will resurface one day. I hope so. Yes? Yes, lots of people were doing the same thing. Lots of sort of literate people would keep a diary as a way to kind of improve themselves, and as a way to kind of, like he was doing, but not to that degree. There's a thing called the Checklist of Unpublished London Diaries. Catchy title. And there's thousands. It's year by year, and you can organise it. People that lived in Hackney or Highgate, so it wasn't particularly exceptional. And he got the idea from a friend. It says that right at the beginning. Yes. Well, that's a very, very interesting question. I don't know if you could all hear that, but I just asked by this gentleman, does he have other writings? Because he rose up, you'd expect that he would. And yes, he did, but sadly, they're pretty much unreadable, because they're not unreadable, they're just jargonic, is probably the best way of describing them. Like, they're just legal papers. He's been consulted about particular issues, and it's not introspective in anything like the same way. He does begin to write letters later in his life, but they're not in shorthand, so they don't have anything of the freshness and the vividness of his earlier style of writing. It's very mannered and overwritten, whereas the shorthand, it just gave it this immediacy that allows us to sort of hotwire ourselves back into his mind. Yeah. Yes, it was a variant upon. Do you remember I mentioned the Mancunian homesick poet guy? It was a variant upon his shorthand, but he kind of tweaked it to make it extra impenetrable. Yeah, for quite good reason. Any other? Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Well, the first thing I say, he wasn't really a dandy or a fop. He was just pretending to be on those particular days. It wasn't all that odd, because he was a law student at Middle Temple at the time when he was doing his dandying, his foppery. Law students had quite a bad reputation at the time for doing very little work, and drinking a lot, and getting into trouble. The whole course, there wasn't like formal tutorials, anything. It was just informal reading and observing trials at Westminster Hall. And he's actually really conscientious and good at that. But it meant he had an awful lot of free time in common with the other law students, and he spent it just drifting around. I mean, I didn't put it into the slides, but I made a map of all the coffee houses he went to, and he had 15 different coffee houses that he'd go to every week without fail. And on an average day, this is all edited out of the main, you don't get the sense in the redacted version. On an average day, he'd go to a coffee house 8 times, probably sometimes 8 different coffee houses, and they were strategically placed to supply him with the latest news. So he got the politics from Waghorns and Westminster, the stocks and shares from the city. He got artistic news from Covent Garden, and it was a way of kind of tuning in. But he, like me, he had a kind of caffeine breakdown at one point. He said that he thought the coffee was going to kill him, and he had to stop. But he only lasted 2 weeks and then just hit the gruel again. Yeah.
These unmentionable stories were not appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
Could you treat us to your favourite one?
No, absolutely not. No, I've got to give you some reason to buy the eventual book. No, they're not that bad. They're kind of similar to the kind of stuff about the commodity. And there's a few bits which are quite surprising, where he's sort of doubting himself. But no, I think I'll put it in a book, maybe. Yeah. But they're good, though. Yeah. I'm glad you're being inquisitive. Okay, I just want to say a big thanks, unless there's any more questions. I can't see any more hands. Thank you very much to Jack Burke for playing. For playing the great man himself, and also thank you for doing the soliloquy at the end over the Barry Lyndon music. I thought that worked really well. If you read this book, this was my first book, it's a time traveler's guide to London, so you go back to different eras and you get dropped in, but it's written in the present tense in the second person as though it's actually happening to you. And there are scenes in the final chapter, which is set in the year 1716, where guess who should come in? And you have a whole conversation, and he starts telling you about the frozen Thames and what he's seen, and my narrative becomes his narrative, then you go back again. So if you want to follow up, that's got some content from the unexpunged diary. Could you go to the final slide, just as the final thing? We're probably over. Oh, I think you're typing into it.
Oh, bollocks.
Oh. There we go, that's the one. There was quite a lot of sort of geography, I guess, but walking and moving and motion in that talk. And I run this company, Unreal City Audio. It's nothing to do with like audiobooks or anything like that. They're all live events, but they're immersive historical tours, a little like the format we've had tonight. It's me doing a lot of talking, but then actors and musicians leap out when you least expect it. They're often themed around drinks as well. So the medieval wine tour, you get a pint of medieval wine as you go around. You don't remember any of it, so you have to keep coming back. The coffee house tour, you drink the coffee exactly as it would have tasted in Dudley Ryder's day, minus the cat urine. There's no cat urine, is it? We brew it to a recipe from the 1660s. A night walk, which is, as the name suggests, entirely in the hours of darkness. Smithfield, Clerkenwell, all the marginalised and dispossessed people, the creatures of the night, and of course the gin tour, and many more. If you're interested in that, it might be worth having a look at the website and coming to join us. But otherwise, thank you very much for listening, and see you again. Thank you.